Good afternoon. My name is Helena van Vliet, and I'm an architect in the Philadelphia area. Can you hear me? It's a bit of an echo. I'm originally from Germany, and I came over here when I was about your age to go to Penn, and I have a master's degree from the University of Pennsylvania. We just toured your labs, and I'm very impressed with the fireplaces and the walls and the masonry that are being built. I was telling the dean that in Germany, as an architecture student, you're required to work in construction for a number of months, and that's an excellent idea because the people who will be building the buildings we design are the trade people. So Jonathan over here asked me to speak to you about biophilic design today, about restorative biophilic design, and the slides that we're showing are all from my projects. The word biophilia first appears in the work of the German evolutionary psychologist Erich Fromm in about the 1960s. And it was popularized in 1995 by Pulitzer Prize-winning Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson in his book, The Biophilia Hypothesis, which he edited with Stephen Kellert, who's the professor of social ecology at Yale. Wilson suggests that there is an instinctive bond between human beings and other living systems, that our human preferences towards natural elements and forms, while refined through experience and culture, may in fact be the product of biological evolution. This is one of our project sites outside of Pittsburgh, by the way. What then is biophilic design? Let me first tell you what biophilic design is not. It is not a style, design style. It's not a particular technique. It is a design process which, while incorporating green building aspects, goes beyond those. This process strives to reintegrate the built environment with the natural environment and to knit together and to restore to wholeness the human-made fabric of our world, to fill the voids and repair the blemishes. This process, which ultimately in everything considers the physiological and psychological well-being of the inhabitants of the spaces which we as designers create with our buildings, and sometimes by default around or between our buildings. And whatever I say today, I would like for you to think about it not just in terms of the actual building, but also in terms of the spaces between our buildings, which are just as important as the buildings themselves. What exactly do I mean? I will tell you what this means to me. Ever since I can remember, I have been aware of the awesome responsibility we as architects and design professionals have. Not unlike physicians, we can, through our actions, influence and determine the quality of life of our clients. In a way, our responsibility goes further than that of physicians because our buildings and settings literally touch many people that we will never meet. People who live and work in our buildings, go to school, pray, and sleep in the structures and environments we create. They will raise children, experience joy, sorrow, illness, loss, death in our buildings. Our buildings will be their second skin, which protects them from inclement weather, keeps them warm or cool, and ideally connect them to and with the community at large. People will breathe in the byproducts of the compounds we select as building materials. They will have to deal with the maintenance, the aging process, the climatic conditions in and around the structures we design today. This will go on day in, day out. And if we build our buildings well for many years, even generations to come. Where I come from, we have buildings that are 1,200 years old, and they're still as valid and beautiful today as they were then. Our responsibility goes further than mere functionality or the selection of sustainable and healthy materials and methods. The buildings and settings we design are rich in subliminal messages called sometimes environmental messages, which influence and shape the emotional state and ultimately health of the people we serve. In that sense, I view architecture as a kind of public service to be taken extremely serious by those who work in this field. In order to serve well, it is my opinion that we as architects have to embark on a lifelong process of learning to understand and shape those very subliminal messages through which our buildings will speak entirely for themselves and long after we're gone. We have to learn to not only engage in a rigorous study of the sustainable technological means and methods of construction, but also to strive to perfect in ourselves the ability to be very much aware, to be aware of all, through all our senses, to feel color vibrations and the various forms of light, to feel sound vibrations, to become aware of the seasons, of weather, of temperature changes, and textural variety, to develop as keen a sense of sensory and intuitive understanding as at all possible. Somebody called it developing our AQ, our awareness quotient, just as important as our IQ. In a way, this work presumes and demands of us designers and architects a process of lifelong self-discovery, of becoming fully alive ourselves before we can venture out to try to influence, hopefully for the better, the lives of our clients through the buildings and settings we design. Only then, much like a good and experienced doctor, are we able to not only intuit the correct, but also the realistically most effective path to wholeness in the built environment of that particular client or institution we want to serve. What then are environmental messages? The emotional messages we receive from our built environment. You have probably observed in yourselves that some environments can make us feel oriented, comfortable and at home, while others will make us feel disoriented, lonely and confused. Some spaces instill awe, perhaps a sense of dignity and belonging, while others make us feel small and insignificant and powerless. Some elevate us to the feeling of higher possibility, even divine connection, while others drag us down and make us feel degenerate and hopelessly flawed. Biophilic design engages the architect in a process to very quietly, but quite consciously, be able to listen to client and context alike, to then employ a vocabulary of design elements and attributes through which severed connections can be restored, through which holes in the fabric of our built environment can be reknitted, through which the buildings and settings we design can reintegrate themselves or even heal the larger natural context or community of buildings they find themselves being a part of. The resulting building or built environment will, ideally, be instinctively felt to be unique, not in a monumental sort of way, but in a harmonious, enlivening sort of way. It will make people feel somehow balanced when at one with themselves in the world. They will be both relaxed and pleasantly stimulated in such settings, reassured and invited to expand. They will feel at home. On my website, helenavanvliet.com, I refer to some of the primary design elements and attributes of biophilic design. They are based on an assortment of findings from a number of interesting crossover disciplines, like social ecology, evolutionary psychology, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, photobiology, biological anthropology, behavioral genetics, biomimicry, environmental science, and environmental medicine. All these are relatively new crossover disciplines, representing the intersections where most real-world problems exist, focusing on the unity of knowledge, which offers the possibility of consilience beyond the natural sciences and across to the other great branches of learning. Since architecture is a crossover discipline in itself, incorporating or touching on many other disciplines and trades, such as technology, art, as in painting, sculpture, woodworking, metalwork, and furniture design, construction with all its various trades, landscape architecture, lighting design, design with water, color psychology, interior design, event planning, psychology, and health, just to name a few. Since all these disciplines are touched upon, the architect is uniquely poised to be the conductor of a symphony of all those trades and disciplines, a kind of mediator, measuring and weighing all this information along with the requirements of the site, the community, and the particular client. It is an astonishingly complex process, a very complex process, but it is very rewarding and interesting, as I can tell you. There's room for many different talents, many different points of view, always keeping in mind the responsibility I spoke of before. Returning to the design elements and attributes of biophilic design, I would like to name a few key elements. Later on, I will show some slides to illustrate each attribute more clearly. I invite you to read about them in greater detail on my website at your leisure if you're interested. There is, of course, the importance of dynamic natural light, seasonal and topographic design, free-flowing interior and exterior spaces, spatial and sensory richness and diversity, natural patterns and hierarchies of scale, sensory gardens and access to moving water, mystery and discovery. These are by nature not hard and fast rules, but rather fluid and malleable characteristics, guidelines, if you will. Mystery and discovery. I want to speak about this aspect in particular for just a moment, since it is so sadly missing in many of our built environments and indeed in our lives in general. The biologist E.O. Wilson, who, as I said earlier, popularized the term biophilia, once wrote, "Without mystery, life shrinks. The completely known becomes a numbing void to the active mind." Our biologically encoded affinity with nature has been instrumental in fostering in us the capacities for curiosity, imagination, creativity, and exploration. We admire and enjoy these qualities in young children, and yet often mourn the loss in our own adult lives. We have been largely content to put up with boring or deadening buildings in urban settings, to expect nothing but sameness and artificially lit flatness from an office, to build pretty much the same house over and over again, no matter what the climactic region, the topography, or even the particular characteristics of the client. We have learned to endure buildings where there is nothing to discover, nothing to explore, nothing to imagine, beyond trite consumer items and the Disney factor virtual reality of facade architecture. Many talented young people disappear in the virtual reality of computer land, at least in part, I'm convinced, because their actual physical environment is devoid of color, texture, context, and beauty, leaving them feeling empty, lost, and disoriented. Nature in this scenario has been largely delegated to the realm of potted plants, if the budget allows. I often feel like a potted plant myself in those buildings, separated from my roots, from wind and weather, from natural light patterns which change throughout the day. I feel sleepy and encapsulated in a hermetically sealed box filled with potentially carcinogenic glues, chemicals, and pigments. As Winston Churchill famously remarked, first we shape our buildings, and then they shape us. It is time that we challenge ourselves to develop a new design aesthetic or process for this time we live in. We can combine the latest technological advances with the spirit of place, with a built response to seasonal patterns, weather, and dynamic natural light, which speaks of a new way to relate to nature not as an adversary, but as a partner, to design and build buildings which are sustainable, not just because of the materials we choose, but also because the people who inhabit them love them, cherish them, want to care for and maintain them over years generations, and indeed centuries. Buildings which are energy efficient not just because they're well insulated, but also because their inhabitants are through the very design invited to interact with the weather, to turn off the air conditioning, to throw open doors and windows, to venture forth to explore once again how refreshing a breeze can be, how enlivening a thunderstorm, how miraculously beautiful a sky at sunset. We need to design buildings which make people want to connect to the outside world. Buildings which affirm our human need for establishing meaningful relation to creation, to inspire feelings of transcendence and enduring connection, which is really the only thing that can defy the aloneness of a single person isolated in space and time. I believe that as a process, biophilic design has the potential to be this path, a path which is new and ancient at the same time, where first curiosity, imagination, creativity, and exploration on the part of the architect or design professional are challenged and asked for, so that then he or she, through their own personal expression, while carefully listening to the context and considering a complex symphony of attributes, can transform the site, the project, the building, into a place where people can feel restfully and joyfully alive, which invites and inspires creativity, curiosity, and connection. I would now like to show you a few more slides of some of our work in which biophilic design attributes are represented. I will try to separate them out a bit, fully realizing that they all interconnect with one another. So I have not separated the sections by project, but rather by biophilic design attribute. The first one on any project would be seasonal and topographic design, because you start with a site, with a piece of land of some sort, and you begin to consider the contours, the wind direction in the summer versus in the winter, which is not the same. Where the south is, where the sun rises, where the sun sets. You want to know about the type of soils that exist. You want to know how the water flows, so you don't build your building as a dam to the natural water flow. You want to know what wildlife exists on the site. These are, this, for instance, is a project which, after several years of having been there now, is really starting to blend in with nature. There's a great variety of styles because they're very different clients, but the approach is always the same. The next aspect would be free-flowing interior and exterior spaces. What I'm talking about here are the edges of our buildings, which oftentimes are very hard. If you incorporate porches, arbors, courtyards, transitional spaces between indoors and outdoors, the building edges become softer, and the exterior wall becomes permeable and more transparent, such that you can work with it depending on the seasons. You can open and close the skin of the building. You can be inside while being outside, or outside while being inside. It becomes a much more fluid connection. You have outdoor rooms that are created in between the buildings, in between one building and another building. You have vistas into the landscape. Next, let's talk about spatial and sensory richness and diversity. What I mean here are what E.O. Wilson calls neurologically nourishing environments. Environments where we are stimulated, where our brain, our senses are stimulated through color, texture, detail, and any kind of opportunity for sensory connections. Those kind of buildings are interesting, but not in a stressful way. They're interesting in a relaxing way, enlivening. Here you have an example, for instance, where the edge of the building blends into the garden such that it's hard to tell where the building exactly ends and where nature begins. It's designed in such a way with the rocks attached to the building at the base so that there's no distinction anymore. A chimney that resembles a tree, the way a tree meets the ground. A way to bring exterior elements in their rough state into the inside of the building. Here is, since a lot of you have experience with the trades, a wonderful example of excellent trade work. I mean, this is a graduated slate roof, very difficult to build. Excellent copper work, tremendous stonework, all coming together to bring the rainwater off the roof and create a waterfall when it rains. So instead of hiding rainwater because it is a problem, a nuisance, or something to get rid of, you're celebrating it, and it's a way to interact with different weather patterns. And you can see from the workmanship that this is an excellent working together of different trades. Look at the edge of the slate roof, how the shingles come together. Limestone. Sensory diversity and richness on the interior, copper, limestone, tile. Colors, fabric. Natural patterns and hierarchies of scale. In nature, we find a lot of patterns and that are actually very repetitive. There's they're called fractals. I don't know if any of you have heard this term, but they keep reappearing in the structures of elements, for instance, of snowflakes or microscopic organisms, and they turn up exactly in the designs that we produce in rugs and stained glass windows. They are exactly the same patterns. So somehow, I have some examples of that later if you're interested, but somehow we seem to be gravitating to a certain kind of design pattern in our artistic expression that resembles exactly what's found in nature. And if you could summarize it, you could say that those patterns that we find in nature are of a coherent complexity. They're not chaotically complex, they're coherent complex. There's an underlying structure that somehow makes sense, that is harmonious, inherently harmonious. There's actually a mathematical formula underlying that that can be measured. So here's an example of hierarchies in design. You have a stone wall which holds as a backdrop the colonnade in front of it, which is a composite marble material, framing a view into a beautiful landscape. a view which actually is made so much richer by slightly veiling it and then framing it with this beautiful arch. Another example of the hierarchy of elements. Slate roofs again, different layers so that the building has depth. It's not just this flat facade, but it has different visual levels, different depth levels. Sensory gardens and access to moving water. Our projects always include gardens, green spaces, which, as I said, if I have my way, are hard to separate from the buildings, particularly after the buildings have been there for some time. They are full of sunlight and shade, restorative, calming, enlivening, filled with texture, fragrance, and subtle sounds. Moving water, refreshing, acoustically dynamic, obscuring unwanted noise from roads. For instance, if you're working on a project near a very busy road, it's wonderful to include water, moving water. Ionizing the air. If you're working on a project where there's a lot of computers involved, an indoor environment, for instance, you could introduce green walls to ionize the air, make it fresher and filled with moisture. Rainfall made visible. We already talked about that. Reflecting pool. Mystery and discovery. This again is the wall I just spoke of from the other side. Beyond it is a beautiful valley with two lakes, small lakes. And rather than having you drive up and just see the valley, we chose to veil it by way of this wall and then channel you into this archway between two existing trees, by the way. They were there before we started this. And then you have, it's sort of like a compression chamber. You burst upon this view, and it is a much greater and more meaningful experience. Creating light and shadow, creating places to explore, winding pathways and stairs. So there are things that you're drawn towards finding out what might be there. Places where you create patterns with sunlight. Depending on the time of day, it will be a very different pattern in the morning from the afternoon. A mysterious door in the middle of a very large stone wall. Dynamic natural light. What do I mean by that? Light changes through the day from morning into evening. If you're walking in the forest, you will notice that different trees have different shade patterns. Some are dense, some are very light shade, some have, you can see the leaf pattern reflected on the ground. So another thing to be aware of when you're an architect is what kind of shade are you looking for? Are you looking for dense shade, or subtle shade, or light shade, or pattern shade? There are many different kinds. Are you looking for contrast, for diffused light, for reflection? Are you looking to relieve stress and mental fatigue in the space you design? Are you looking to re-energize people? What is the program? Dr. Herman will speak about this subject in a few moments from a medical point of view. A few more examples of sunlight. Sunlight as a design element, not just broad sheets of glass, but very consciously designed spaces. In this space, for instance, the sun is, of course, appear at different times of the day in very different patterns and locations. Our latest project this summer, the design completed, not yet built hopefully next year, is just west of New York City. And it is a combination between a home and an office for a very large horse farm. Actually houses some of the American Olympic winners in dressage and jumping, this farm. And these clients wanted a house that was a combination between nature and technology. That was a very contemporary house, just glass and stone, natural stone. It has an extensive green roof there on portions of it. It also has a lot of solar panels, solar awnings on all the south-facing windows. And they will be used to electrolyze water to create hydrogen for the fuel cell, which is almost on the market, probably in a year or two. So we're setting all this up so this house can be autonomous and people can plug their cars into the house and so forth. So the shape of this house is a direct result of the site. South is to the left, north is to the right. The north facade is always very complex because a building casts a north shadow on the north side, which is a place where pretty much nothing grows. It's a sort of a dead, unpleasant place. So we kept the north facade very small, and we terraced the building down to the north-northwest so that the shadow also will be a terraced shadow. It's not this gigantic wall of north shadow. It's a step-down shadow, which means that each terrace shades the one below, which means by the time it hits the ground, there isn't a whole lot of shadow to contend with in terms of planting. It's not an ideal site for solar exposure because the main view faces to the northwest, which is not great. So we shaped the building in such a way that when you come into the entry courtyard, which is south-facing and very sunny, very warm, all the glass expanses are shaded with solar awnings, which not only produce, energy, but also shade the glass. And it's the same kind of shade. I don't know if you're familiar with solar awnings. I brought some literature on it. It's not a dense shade. It's a pattern shade, kind of like a tree canopy. It's actually very attractive. And then there's an exterior stone stair that leads up to an extensive green roof garden, which will actually be a vegetable garden because the deer apparently eat everything on the ground. So we put the vegetable garden on the roof, leading to the office. In the center, this is another view of the courtyard area. What's reflective are the PV awnings. This is the west elevation. The problem with west elevations is that they're very difficult to shade in the late afternoon because the angle of the sun is very low. So we had to plant, we will have to plant a few deciduous shade trees there so that the building does not overheat on afternoons in the summer. Just wanted to go back briefly. In the center you see what looks like a glass cupola. I call it a solar eye. It will be a PV glass will be used in that, and it's a way for the building to ventilate itself. These particular clients are not big on air conditioning. So the building is designed completely to self-ventilate without air conditioning in the summer. So at night, louvers will be opened in this cupola, and the hot air that's in the building will be drawn out, and cool air will be let in at the base of the building at the same time. So I'm hoping that it will be largely self-cooling between the PV awnings and the stone and the solar eye. I think it'll be successful. Another aspect of this project is vertical geothermal. I put down some reading suggestions if anybody's interested. These are books, some new, some older, that have meant a lot to me and that I have that I have enjoyed looking at over and over again. I brought some of the books with me if you're interested in looking at them. Okay. Talking about health a little bit more. The World Health Organization defines health as the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease and infirmity. Many of today's physiological and psychological ailments seem to be stress-related, seem to originate, at least in part, from stress-related depletion, from a sense of being overwhelmed, disoriented, isolated, and unable to cope. Problems related to anxiety, depression, allergies, asthma, cancer, diabetes, just to name a few, are on the rise. E.O. Wilson speaks of biophilic design's potential for neurological nourishment. I would now like to, with the help of Dr. Harriman, explore the connection between restorative biophilic design and health and well-being just a little more closely. Dr. Harriman is an immunologist and has worked in the field of immune-mediated diseases for many years, both in academia as well as in industry. He's a fellow of the American College of Physicians and holds memberships in several other medical organizations, including the American Academy of Asthma, Allergy, and Immunology, the American Society of Hematology, the Federation of Clinical Immunology Societies, and the American Association of Immunology. Gosh, I said that without falling over it. He's a graduate of Berkeley and the UC San Diego.
Well, thank you, Helena, for that very nice introduction, and good afternoon. As Helena said, I want to just take a few minutes to talk about the health benefits of incorporating biophilic design into architecture. And I hope you can appreciate from Helena's presentation the value of including biophilic design concepts into architectural design. And I want to try and take that a little step further and talk about where there's some potential health benefits to incorporating those concepts into architectural design as well. Helena mentioned to you my background in terms of medical background, immunologist, and I've spent much of my career in my life studying immunology and immune-mediated diseases and the effects of suppression of the immune system on development of disease. And I'm going to touch upon that a little bit in my presentation about how some aspects of the environment can impact on the immune system. But I want to also talk about other areas where the environment can affect the function of the body, health, as Helena talked about. I had interest when I was going to school at Berkeley in environmental studies, and actually I took a course in solar energy back in the 1970s, which I know is a long time ago, but it was back before there was very much interest in the concept of using solar energy, so I'm pleased to see a lot of progress has been made, albeit slowly, to get to where we are today. So I've had an interest for a long time about the environment and renewable energy and the areas that Helena touched upon. Let's see. Okay. In July of 2009, there was a symposium in Philadelphia. It was the American Society of Photobiology, and they did a symposium on photobiology and architectural design. Very interesting meeting because what they did was try to bring together the whole field of photobiology with architecture and find areas where there were relevance to each of these fields that the two disciplines needed to understand a little bit better and where they could help each other out. And one of the people that spoke there was a guy named John Eberhard, and he was the founder and past president of an academy called the American Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture. I would encourage all of you to go to the website and look at this, this particular academy and their website if you get a chance. It's really quite interesting. But one of the things that he touched upon was, what does it mean to see? And, we really don't know exactly how the brain functions. There's, this brain in our head, but we know very little about some of the specific ways in which it functions and what leads to consciousness and feelings and all the things that we're aware of. But certainly a lot of progress has been made over the last several years in better understanding how the neurobiology correlates with different aspects of the mind, how we think, how we feel, etc. And one of the things that he's been particularly interested in is how the various architectural features in the environment can impact on how we think and how we feel. And I think that's a very important issue to be aware of. There was a article in Neurology magazine a couple years ago, actually 2009, in which he wrote how consciousness arises from particular neural processes resulting from the interactions between our brain, our body, and the world. We would next be able to identify the key properties of conscious experiences and understand the role of qualia in neural terms and how to connect these scientific descriptions of consciousness to human knowledge and experience. So I think it's really exciting to think about how we can tie together concepts of architecture, how the brain works, neurobiology, and how that leads to our state of mind, health, mood, etc. So in terms of health, one of the areas that was touched upon at this meeting was the impact of stress on health, and also in particular how various aspects of our environment, including our architectural environment, can cause stress. And I hope you can appreciate from Helena's presentation how if architecture is done well and designed well, it can lead to a reduction in stress. It can be a very pleasant environment, and it will improve your health. On the other side, if you have architectural design that is chaotic, is stressful, does not really incorporate some of the biophilic designs that Helena was talking about, that can increase levels of stress, and that can have adverse effects on health. And one of the things that was touched upon in this photobiology symposium was the concept that Alzheimer's patients, as they get, as the day progresses later in the day, early evening, they become more agitated. That's a well-known phenomenon in medicine. So why is that? Well, one of the things that happens is that they lose orientation because of loss of visual cues and so forth. But it's interesting to think about how one may be able to take advantage of light and some of the dynamic light concepts that Helena was talking about in potentially treating Alzheimer's patients or helping them to cope better with their environment. There's been books and many articles written about the effect of the environment, including light and other aspects of the environment, architectural design aspects, on the immune function. I'm going to talk a little bit more later about how that can really impact on the function of the immune system and lead to problems with disease when the immune system isn't functioning properly. So in terms of light and health, what I think is important to understand is that light comes into our eyes and hits the retina, the back of our eyes, and it's carried via the optic nerves to many different parts of the brain. The one that we're most familiar with is in the occipital area of the brain, the back of the brain, the visual cortex, which is where the processing of this signals occurs and allows us to see. That's the visual part of the brain that allows us to see things. However, there are other regions of the brain that are involved in other biological processes, and the eye has a role to play in that. There is a second region of the brain that's called the retinal hypothalamic tract, which goes to another region of the brain called the thalamus, the hypothalamus. And it's here that a number of important physiological processes occur. Control of hormonal production and secretion occurs there. And all of these are very important in maintaining homeostasis in the body, normal functioning of the body. that leads to a healthy state with good productivity, performance, and well-being. So while most of us know about this pathway, the visual stimulation pathway, where we see, and obviously that's important as far as your overall well-being, this other pathway, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, is a very important pathway in terms of maintaining health. And it turns out that about 9 or 10 years ago, a discovery was made about a new receptor in the retina of the eye. It's called the melanopsin receptor. And it is a distinct receptor from the rod and cone receptors that are responsible for vision. Most of you probably have heard of the rod and cone receptors. This is another receptor in the eye, and it has a very specific function. When light stimulates this receptor and it gets transmitted through this retinal hypothalamic tract, it goes to this region I was talking about, the hypothalamus, and it is responsible for a number of physiological processes, which I want to touch upon in just a moment. One of the interesting features of this particular receptor is it's stimulated by different wavelengths of light than the rod and cone receptors that are responsible for vision. So the melanopsin receptor picks up predominantly its peak reception is more in the blue spectra, trending towards the ultraviolet spectra of light, whereas the rod and cone receptors are shifted more towards the infrared spectra. Well, so what are some of the important biological and behavioral functions that are impacted by this stimulation through the melanopsin receptor, the retinal hypothalamic pathway? Well, melatonin secretion, and that's a very important hormone that's produced by the body that's responsible for ensuring proper functioning of the circadian rhythm in the body, and probably many of you have heard about the circadian rhythm. That's really important in terms of the wake-sleep cycle. So when all of us get sleepy and go to sleep and then wake up according to a 24-hour cycle, that's actually all under the control of these processes in the brain that are mediated in large part by melatonin. Other physiological processes like body temperature, heart rate, alertness, cognitive performance, a number of other functions are regulated by some of these hormones or other processes going on in the hypothalamic tract. And importantly, cortisol secretion is regulated by the hypothalamic tract. And when you have impairment in circadian rhythm, that can adversely affect the production of cortisol. Why is that important? Because for me, it's very relevant because cortisol is a key hormone in the body that controls or has important regulatory functions in the immune system. And high levels of cortisol can actually suppress immune function. And another interesting aspect of this understanding this circadian rhythm and the effects of light on the melanopsin receptors is that's been shown that there is a disease called seasonal affective disorder, and there have been some recent work done that has shown that you can actually do light therapy for people with seasonal affective disorder. That's a disorder where during the wintertime or in high latitudes where people don't get enough light, they develop very significant depression, and it's seasonally related or related to absence of sufficient daylight. So you can actually treat them with light boxes. I think that's obviously an important consideration as far as the importance of this physiological effect. So there are a number of other health effects, health benefits of biophilic design. I want to just briefly touch upon some of them here. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of them, but I think they're very important. First of all, in terms of enhanced healing and recovery, it's been shown that when hospital rooms are designed properly with sufficient natural dynamic light and natural environments, that you can see a significant improvement in the healing rate of patients after surgery, and they require less pain medication as well. So I think that's a very important benefit of this particular incorporating biophilic design elements into this. Also, healthier childhood and development. Children who are in rooms where there's lots of natural lighting and natural settings have improved maturation and development. And in bright daylit classrooms, they learn better, they have better performance in school, better attendance, and even healthier teeth. In addition to that, there's improved attention and concentration and cognitive function. Reading improvement can be improved as much as 20% when there's well daylit classrooms for students. Also, when there's nearby trees that are associated with higher levels of attention and discipline, less violence, and enhanced coping, adaptive, and neighborly interpersonal behavior. Office settings with natural lighting, natural ventilation, and other environmental features result in improved worker performance, lower stress, and greater motivation and reduced absenteeism. And also, contact with nature has been linked to enhanced cognitive functioning on tasks that require concentration and memory. Also, in terms of circadian rhythm hormonal balance, I talked about that some. Clearly, as I mentioned, the circadian clock is important in regulating a number of functions, and the production of various hormones in the pituitary gland, the pineal gland, adrenal gland, and thyroid glands are regulated by the hypothalamus and by the circadian rhythm. Improved immune function. I mentioned the effects of lighting on immune function, but regular exposure to dynamic natural light, as I said, will allow for proper circadian alignment, and that this has very beneficial effects on cortisol secretion and can improve the immune resistance. Also, stress can suppress the immune function, and that can lead to, obviously, problems in terms of increased susceptibility to disease and potentially even to certain kinds of cancer. Insulin resistance, obesity, osteoporosis, and cell aging have also been associated with levels of stress in the environment. And then lastly, vitamin D metabolism. Vitamin D is actually produced in the skin when it's exposed to sunlight, and so that's a very important hormone in the body for proper functioning of the bone, to have strong bones, and it also has a beneficial effect in the immune system as well. So that's another aspect of sunlight that's very important. So when you take all of these various considerations into account, I think it's important to realize that there are a number of health benefits that biophilic design concepts can provide for, and hope that you will consider that as you move forward in your in school and in your future careers when you are designing buildings. And thank you very much.
All right, so this is directed towards Helena. Do you work more with residential projects or commercial projects?
Residential.
Residential.
I also do some conservation development projects, which I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a way to develop land without destroying the landscape. So you basically identify the most important natural features before you start developing it, and you stay away from them. So that in the end you have the landscape is still there when you're finished. So you're putting the buildings, the houses very carefully, usually in a cluster format, and it maintains wildlife corridors, it maintains wildlife access to rivers and waterways. It stays away from slopes. The buildings are never on top of the hills, they're always below the top of the hills, so that the landscape, remains what it is before you get there. And you ideally build in the least desirable agricultural area, so that in the end you have large contiguous sections left for farming or food production of some sort. Yeah.
As you had spoken earlier about your attraction to health and biophilia in architecture, what exactly was it, and what time of your life did it draw you in towards that aspect? And
I thought about that. My father was an architect, so that was kind of, I kind of fell into it, and I have a lot of people in my family who are architects. I had some fairly significant health problems when I was younger, so I think I became interested in health that way, and then I became very much aware of the combination between health and the built environment. As I said before, also from a toxicity, initially from a toxicity point of view, you know, the materials, the vinyls, the glues, and, you know, what are we inhaling and what is being outgassed in the production process is, you know, mind-boggling. When you look at any kind of caulk tubing, they're all made in Mexico. They all say, you know, causes genetic damage, and we're using them, you know, everywhere. That's just one example. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add to that, Doctor? What about you and your attraction to the biophilia as far as the architecture?
Well, you know, as I said, I've been interested in the whole area of how the environment impacts on us, particularly with regard to health. And it was very clear as I became acquainted with Helena and got to know the work that she was doing and learning about biophilia, which I had not known about before, and then going to this photobiology workshop last year, it became clear to me that there was a lot of close connections between architectural design and health, and some of the things that I touched upon. And I became very interested in trying to understand how we could better tie together architectural design, biophilia concepts, and improvement in health in our society.
In general, the sciences don't tend to talk to the arts. You know, there's a sort of divide, and a school like this is really perfect to start to bridge this kind of gap. A lot of times if you come from a very high design-oriented school like Penn, where I went, a lot of people who graduate from there come out to the jobs and have really have no idea what they're looking at. What? What is it?
I just turned it off there.
They have no idea what they're looking at when they come out to the job. What happened?
This shows you electromagnetic radiation, huh?
So one of my things I love talking about is there are design people, and then there are technology people, and in a lot of offices they don't communicate very well. So you have the designers designing away over here, and then they hand it to the technology people, and something else comes out in the end that neither of them quite anticipated, you know. And that's a shame, because why couldn't the designers know about technology and vice versa, and everybody know about construction, so that when you get out and talk to the guys in the field, you're actually talking their language. And I have tremendous respect for a lot of tradespeople. I've learned a lot from a lot of these guys, you know, and a lot of them are real artists, and they take a great deal of pride in their work, and they're masters. But to start talking to one another in all these different, seemingly unrelated but very much related fields is something we need to start to do. Yeah.
Do you have any questions?
There's some questions.
I'll pass the mic. Are these questions for?
Oh, I see.
So, Dr. Harriman, what drew you to the medical field?
So, well, I've been interested in science ever since I was a little kid. In fact, my parents used to buy me these little chemistry sets that I would play with when I was a kid. And, well, came close a couple of times to hurting myself. But anyway, and then as I got older, I was actually in the Army. I was a paramedic in the Army, and so I got exposed to medicine fairly directly then, and I realized that I enjoyed doing it. So after I got out of the Army, I went to medical school and, I went to college and decided I wanted to go to medical school and got into it then. And I went down the path of immunology because I really found that very interesting, the whole area of the immune system. It plays a very important role in many aspects of health in the body, protection from infections, protection from cancer. When the immune system goes awry, then you get into trouble with autoimmune diseases, allergic diseases, asthma, hay fever, etc. So it plays a role in so many different diseases that I found that to be a very stimulating, interesting area to get involved in.
Helena, which architects have influenced you the most?
Well, there's always Frank Lloyd Wright. You guys have been working with some of his work. Amazingly talented man. Some of the current living architects, there's Fay Jones. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's an American. Christopher Alexander and Christopher Day are both British architects. I have some of their books here with me. A Swiss architect by the name of Peter Zumthor. We just toured one of his buildings in Germany recently. Incredibly imaginative work. He built a museum there in Cologne, full of texture, full of feeling, full of light, drama, a real experience, just the building itself. So those would be the ones mainly.
Dr. Herman, if you could suggest top 2 strategies for mitigating stress through building design, what would they be?
Stress in building design? Well, I think they would be the ones that I talked a little bit about in the presentation. I think one is the natural scenery. And, there's, I think, a lot of examples where if you, simple ideas where when you have windows, if the windows are looking out over, beautiful scenery, trees, plants, vistas, or whatever, versus a window that's looking out at another building, a concrete wall across it, or something of that nature. I mean, it doesn't take, a physician to know that that kind of thing is stressful and not good for somebody's well-being and psychological health and probably their physical health. So certainly paying some attention to how you design buildings to incorporate natural scenery and make it a more pleasant experience for the people in the buildings would be one important concept. And the other one is what I talked about, which is lighting, the whole concept of dynamic lighting and how you design buildings to incorporate that into the buildings, because it plays a very important role in circadian rhythms, in immune function, in other aspects of health. So I think those are 2 areas that I would say would be important ways to improve that.
What did you say?
That's all the questions that we had. Does the audience have any questions for either of our guest speakers today?
I just wanted to say, if any of you are going to look at my website and there are many links on my website, helenavanvliet.com, to different organizations that we spoke of today, photobiology, neuroscience, and architecture, many different organizations that are related to this. Look them up. You can also email me personally if you have questions or thoughts on the subject. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you.